There's a photograph that shouldn't exist, taken in 1897 in rural Kentucky. It shows 11 children standing in front of a weathered farmhouse. Their faces are blurred, not from age or damage to the print, but because the photographer's hand was shaking. He left the next morning and never spoke about what he saw in that house. The family paid him in silver coins that he later threw into a river. What the camera captured that day was the beginning of the end for one of America's most secretive bloodlines, a family that spent 4 generations trying to hide what they were becoming from the world and from themselves. This isn't a story about royalty or famous names. This is about the Tuttles, a family that came to the Cumberland Plateau in 1836 with nothing but determination and a belief that isolation would protect them. They were wrong. What protected them from the world eventually consumed them from within. By 1952, there were only 3 Tuttles left alive, and none of them could speak. The last one died in a state institution in 1961, and when they cleaned out her room, they found a box hidden beneath the floorboards. Inside were letters, dozens of them, written by family members across 70 years, each one describing the same slow horror, watching their children change, watching their siblings forget how to be human, watching a genetic curse tighten its grip generation after generation. The Commonwealth of Kentucky sealed the records in 1964. The property was sold to a mining company that tore down every building and burned what remained, but the letters survived. A social worker kept them. She couldn't explain why. She just knew that someone, someday, needed to understand what happened to the Tuttles, what happens when a family's desire for privacy becomes a prison, what happens when bloodlines fold in on themselves until there's nothing left but the consequences. This is the story of genetic collapse, of a family that became its own worst enemy, and of the terrible mathematics that govern human survival when we forget that some doors should never be closed. Samuel Tuttle didn't think he was making a mistake when he married his second cousin, Mary, in 1841. In fact, by the standards of isolated Appalachian communities, it was normal, expected even. The valleys were deep, the roads were bad, and the families who settled there rarely left. Marriage within the extended family wasn't seen as dangerous. It was seen as practical. It kept land together. It kept secrets inside the family circle. It kept the bloodline pure, which in their minds meant protected from the corruption of outsiders and the chaos of the changing world beyond the mountains. Samuel and Mary had 9 children. 8 of them survived past childhood, which was considered a blessing in an era when half of all children died before age 5. But something was different about the Tuttle children. Neighbors noticed the kids were quiet, too quiet. They didn't play like other children. They stood in groups and stared at things no one else could see. One of them, a boy named Jacob, never learned to speak. Another, a girl named Prudence, could speak but only repeated what others said to her, like an echo trapped in human form. The family explained it away. Mountain fever, they said. Bad air. The will of God. But Samuel knew, in his personal journal, discovered decades later in a trunk buried on the property, he wrote a single sentence that he crossed out so many times the paper tore. "We have done this to ourselves." He never explained what he meant. He didn't need to. By the time he died in 1869, 6 of his 8 surviving children had married within the family, cousins marrying cousins, the gene pool contracting like a fist, closing around something fragile. The Tuttles believed they were preserving themselves. They were actually erasing themselves, one generation at a time. There's a term for what they were doing. It's called inbreeding depression. When closely related individuals reproduce recessive genes, genes that carry hidden defects, have a much higher chance of pairing up. In the outside world, these genes stay dormant, masked by healthier variants from unrelated parents. But in a closed genetic loop, they surface, they express, and once they do, they don't stop. The Tuttles weren't just passing down their family name. They were passing down a genetic debt that would eventually come due in full. By 1880, the Tuttle family had 32 living members spread across 3 generations. On paper, they looked like a success story, a thriving clan carved out of the wilderness. But the census taker that year noted something strange in his field report. He wrote that the family seemed afflicted by a common melancholy and that several members exhibited signs of feeble-mindedness. He recommended a follow-up visit by a physician. That visit never happened. The Tuttles made it clear that outsiders were not welcome on their land. What the census taker didn't see was what happened behind closed doors. The letters that survived tell a different story. A mother wrote about her son, who was born with fingers fused together, who screamed at the sight of sunlight and had to be kept in a darkened room his entire short life. Another letter describes twin girls who looked identical, but one could walk and the other never could. Her legs twisted inward from birth, bones that never formed correctly. A father wrote about waking up to find his daughter standing over him in the night, staring, unable to explain why. She was 14. She had the cognitive ability of a 5-year-old. The Tuttles began to understand they had a problem, but they didn't understand the scope. They thought it was bad luck. A curse, maybe. Some believed it was punishment from God for unnamed sins. They prayed. They isolated further. They stopped inviting neighbors to gatherings. They stopped going to church. And most devastatingly, they kept marrying each other. Because to marry outside the family would mean admitting something was wrong. It would mean letting strangers see what they'd become. And the Tuttles valued their privacy more than they valued their survival. The third generation was where the collapse accelerated. Of the 32 family members alive in 1880, only 11 would live to see 1900. The others died young, from seizures, from infections their bodies couldn't fight, from birth defects incompatible with life. One woman gave birth to 6 children. 3 were stillborn, 2 died before age 7. The last one, a boy named Thomas, lived to be 19. He spent most of his life sitting in a chair, rocking back and forth, humming a tune no one recognized. When he died, they found he'd carved symbols into the wooden armrests, deep grooves worn into the wood from years of repetitive motion. No one knew what the symbols meant. Maybe he didn't either. There's a letter dated March 1903 that changes everything we think we know about the Tuttles. It was written by a woman named Elizabeth Tuttle to her sister, who had moved to Ohio, one of the few family members who ever left. Elizabeth's handwriting is shaky, hard to read, but the message is clear. She knew, she understood what was happening. She wrote, "The blood has gone thin and poisoned. Every child born here now carries the mark. We have become a family of ghosts wearing human skin. I begged Henry not to marry Constance. I begged him. She is his first cousin, and already her mind wanders. But he says there is no one else. He says, we cannot bring shame by marrying outside, so the cycle continues, and I watch and I say nothing, because what good are words against a curse we built ourselves?" Elizabeth's letter was never sent. It was found folded inside her Bible after she died in 1911. She was 34 years old. The cause of death listed on her certificate was exhaustion and nervous collapse. Henry, the brother she mentioned, married Constance anyway. They had 4 children. 2 were born deaf. 1 was born blind. The 4th appeared healthy at birth, but by age 6 was having seizures so severe his parents had to tie him to the bed at night so he wouldn't hurt himself. He died at age 12. His death certificate lists the cause as epileptic fit, but the doctor's private notes, discovered later, tell a different story. He wrote that the boy's skull was malformed, his brain visibly underdeveloped, and that he'd seen similar cases in other isolated families practicing what he carefully termed concentrated bloodlines. By 1910, the Tuttle family was down to 14 members. They lived on 3 adjoining properties, barely speaking to each other, barely surviving. The children born in this generation were different in a way that went beyond physical disability. They were detached, emotionally absent. Several family letters describe children who didn't cry, didn't laugh, who looked at their parents like strangers. One mother wrote that her daughter would sometimes stop in the middle of a task and stand frozen for hours, unreachable, as if her mind had left her body entirely. When she finally moved again, she had no memory of the lost time. The worst part wasn't what was happening. It was that the family knew and continued anyway. A cousin married a cousin in 1915, another pair in 1921. Each time there were objections, quiet protests, letters exchanged in secret. But the family patriarch, a man named Silas Tuttle, held firm. He believed that introducing outside blood would weaken the family, would dilute whatever strength they had left. He didn't understand that the strength was already gone, that they were fighting over scraps of a genetic legacy that had cannibalized itself into extinction. The 1930 census recorded 7 Tuttles. By 1940, there were 5. The end was no longer approaching, it had arrived. A social worker visited the property in 1938 after reports from a traveling preacher who said he'd seen conditions that haunted his Christian conscience. Her report, filed with the county and later sealed, described a scene that reads like something out of a nightmare. She found 3 adults living in a single-room cabin with no running water, no electricity, surrounded by their own waste. 2 of them, she noted, were unable to communicate in any meaningful way and showed signs of severe intellectual disability and physical deterioration. The third, a woman in her 40s named Ruth, could speak but only in fragments. When asked how old she was, Ruth said, "Old as the trees." When asked if she needed help, she said, "Too late for help. We're the last ones. We're what's left when a family eats itself." The social worker tried to arrange for the family to be moved to a state facility where they could receive care. Ruth refused. She said the land was theirs, and they would die on it like all the others. And for a while they did stay, but by 1947 Ruth was alone. The 2 others had died within months of each other, one from pneumonia, the other from what the local doctor described as failure to thrive, a term usually reserved for infants. Ruth lasted another year before she was found unconscious in her cabin by a mail carrier. She was taken to a state hospital where she lived, mostly catatonic, until 1952. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have been the one to break the cycle, or would the weight of family loyalty have kept you silent? The final chapter of the Tuttle family isn't dramatic. There's no grand revelation, no moment of redemption. Ruth died without speaking another coherent sentence. The property sat abandoned for years before the state auctioned it off. But in 1961, a historian researching Appalachian settlement patterns stumbled onto the Tuttle name in old county records. He started digging. He found census data, death certificates, property deeds. And then he found the social worker who'd kept the letters. She was retired by then, living in Lexington. She gave him the box and told him she'd been waiting for someone to ask. She said, People need to know what happened, not to judge them, but to understand that isolation has a cost, that families can love each other to death. The historian wrote a paper that was never published. The Kentucky Historical Society rejected it on the grounds that it was too disturbing and served no educational purpose. The box of letters was donated to a university archive where it sat untouched for 30 years. It was only recently, when a genealogist researching her own family connections in the area, that the Tuttle story resurfaced. She published excerpts online. They went viral, not because people enjoyed the horror, but because they recognized something in it. The danger of closing yourself off, the danger of believing that purity is the same as strength. The science behind what happened to the Tuttles isn't complicated, but it is absolute. Every human carries recessive genes, genetic variants that only cause problems when two copies are inherited, one from each parent. In a diverse population, the chances of two people carrying the same harmful recessive gene are relatively low. But when relatives reproduce, those chances skyrocket. First cousins share about 12.5% of their DNA. When they have children, there's a significantly higher probability that harmful recessive genes will pair up and express themselves. Do this for multiple generations, and the effect compounds exponentially. The Tuttles weren't unique. History is full of families that destroyed themselves through genetic isolation. The most famous example is the Habsburg dynasty of Europe, whose practice of intermarriage led to the infamous Habsburg jaw, a severe facial deformity caused by mandibular prognathism. But the Habsburgs had wealth and power to cushion their decline. They had doctors and servants and political influence. The Tuttles had nothing but each other and a stubborn belief that the outside world was more dangerous than the world they were creating inside their own bloodline. They were wrong, and that wrongness killed them. What makes the Tuttle case particularly haunting is the documentation. Most families in similar situations left no record. Their stories dissolved into local legend, whispered about but never confirmed. But the Tuttles wrote it down. They knew what was happening. They described it in painful detail. They watched their children suffer, and they blamed God. They blamed the land. They blamed bad luck. But they never blamed the one thing they could have changed: themselves, their choices, their refusal to open the door. Modern genetics has given us the language to understand what the Tuttles experienced: inbreeding depression, genetic load, loss of heterozygosity. These terms didn't exist in 1840, but the consequences did. The human genome needs diversity to function properly. It needs the constant shuffling and mixing that comes from unrelated individuals reproducing. When that diversity collapses, when the gene pool shrinks to a puddle, the system breaks down, mutations accumulate, immune systems weaken, cognitive function deteriorates, and eventually the line simply ends. Not with violence or drama, but with exhaustion, with bodies that can't sustain themselves, with minds that can't hold onto consciousness, with a genetic code that has run out of room to maneuver. The Tuttles collapsed under the weight of their own DNA. Every marriage was another brick removed from the foundation. Every child born was another roll of the dice with worse and worse odds. By the end, they weren't even a family anymore. They were a case study in what happens when isolation becomes identity. The Tuttle property is gone now. The mining company that bought it stripped the land bare in the 1970s and moved on. There's nothing left to mark where the family lived and died. No headstones. The family cemetery was bulldozed. No buildings. They were burned. No descendants. The line ended with Ruth, but the story refuses to stay buried. People who live in the area still talk about the Tuttles. They tell their children cautionary tales about what happens when families turn inward. When pride becomes poison, when the need to belong somewhere becomes the thing that destroys you, what haunts people about the Tuttle story isn't just the tragedy of it. It's the inevitability. Once the pattern started, once the first generation of cousins married and had children, the trajectory was set. Each generation had fewer options, fewer healthy partners within the family, but leaving the family, marrying someone from outside, felt like betrayal. Like admitting defeat, so they stayed, they married each other, they had children who suffered, and they wrote letters describing the suffering while doing nothing to stop it. That's the part that keeps people awake at night. The knowing, the consciousness of the harm combined with the paralysis of tradition and shame. There's a broader lesson here that extends beyond one family in Kentucky. The Tuttles represent something we don't like to talk about. The danger of closed systems, of communities, ideologies, or families that refuse outside input, that see diversity as contamination rather than strength. It doesn't matter if we're talking about genetics or ideas. The principle is the same. When you stop allowing new information, new perspectives, new blood into the system, that system begins to decay. It feeds on itself, it becomes brittle, and eventually it collapses. The last letter in the box was written by Ruth in 1946, a year before she was found unconscious. The handwriting is almost illegible, the spelling erratic, but the message is clear. She wrote, "I am the end of something that should have ended long ago. I am what happens when a family loves itself too much and the world too little. If anyone finds this, know that we were not evil, we were afraid, and that fear ate us alive." The social worker who kept the letters said she read that passage once and never looked at it again. She said it was too much truth for one piece of paper to hold. The Tuttle family is not a ghost story. It's not a mystery. It's a document of self-destruction carried out slowly over 4 generations by people who believed they were protecting something sacred. What they were actually protecting was the mechanism of their own extinction. And that's the real horror, not that it happened, but that they chose it. Every single step of the way, they chose it, until there was nothing left to choose and no one left to make the choice. The secret family line didn't collapse under its own genetics by accident. It collapsed because genetics is just math, and the Tuttles kept feeding the equation the same variables until the only possible outcome was 0. That's not fate, that's consequence. And consequences don't care about good intentions or family loyalty or the fear of outsiders. They just are. And the Tuttles learned that the hardest way possible, by disappearing completely.